Theories of classification. In biology, taxonomy, that word is from ancient Greek, and taxis means arrangement and nomia means method, is the scientific study of naming, defining, and classifying groups of biological organisms based on shared characteristics. Organisms are grouped into taxa, and these groups are given a taxonomic rank. Groups of a given rank can be aggregated to form a more inclusive group of higher rank, thus creating a taxonomic hierarchy. The Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus is regarded as the founder of the current system of taxonomy, as he developed a ranked system known as Linnaean taxonomy for organizing and categorizing organisms and binomial nomenclature for naming organisms. With advances in theory, data, and analytical technology of biological systematics, the Linnaean system has transformed into a system of modern biological classification intended to reflect the evolutionary relationship among organisms, both living and extinct. Alpha and beta taxonomy. The term alpha taxonomy, introduced by William Bertram Terrell in 1935, is used to refer to the disciplines of finding, describing, and naming taxa, particularly species. So Ernest Mayr in 1968 defined beta taxonomy as the classification of ranks higher than species. History of classification. Pre-Linnaean. Early taxonomists. Naming and classifying our surroundings has probably been taking place as long as mankind has been able to communicate, especially to communicate the names of poisonous and edible plants and animals to other members of the group. This is something which is related to their survival also. Otherwise, when people consume this poisonous fruits, they may die. So this is something which is related to their survival. Medicinal plant illustrations shown in Egyptian wall paintings in ancient periods indicate that a basic taxonomy was in place. In ancient times, organisms were first classified by Aristotle by their parts or attributes into two groups, plants and animals. Some of his groups of animals, such as Anhema, animals without blood, invertebrates, and Enhema, animals with blood, vertebrates, are still commonly used today. His student Theophrastus carried on this tradition, mentioning some 500 plants and their uses in his Historia Plantarum. The medieval period. Taxonomy in the Middle Ages was largely based on the Aristotelian system. His ideas were based on targeting the complete world in a single continuum as per the scala naturae, the natural ladder. So, medieval thinkers used abstract philosophical and logical considerations. Renaissance and early modern period. During the Renaissance period, categorizing organisms became more prevalent. Development of sophisticated optical lenses allowing the morphology of organisms to be studied in much great detail. An Italian physician, Andrea Cesalpino, who has been called the first taxonomist, described more than 1,500 plant species, two large plant families that he first recognized are still in use today, the Asteraceae and Brassiaceae. Then in the 17th century, John Ray published details of over 1,800 plants, 18,000 plant species. The next major taxonomic work were produced by Joseph Pitton de Tournefort, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, which directly influenced Linnaeus as it was the text he used as a young student. The Linnaean era, the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus ushered a new era of taxonomy. With his major works, Systema Naturae, Species Plantarum, he revolutionized modern taxonomy. His works implemented a standardized binomial naming system for animals and plant species. He introduced the standard of class, order, genus, and species. Currently, plant and animal taxonomists regard Linnaean work as a starting point for valid names. Modern system of classification. With Darwin's theory, general acceptance quickly appeared that a classification should reflect the Darwinian principle of common descent. Tree of life representations became popular in scientific works with known fossil groups incorporated. One of the first modern groups tied to fossil ancestors was birds. Using the then newly discovered fossils of Archaeopteryx, Thomas Henry Huxley pronounced that they had evolved from dinosaurs. The resulting description, that of dinosaurs giving rise to or being the ancestors of birds, is the essential hallmark of evolutionary taxonomic thinking. As evolutionary taxonomy is based on denying taxonomic ranks, the two terms are interchangeable. The cladistic method has emerged since the 1960s. In 1958, Julian Huxley was very famous and he used the term clade. And in 1960, Kane and Harrison introduced the term cladistic. The salient feature is arranged taxa and hierarchical evolutionary tree. Here we could say classification. First one is the essentialism. Essentialism is the view that kinds are defined by underlying properties or characters, in essence, that is shared by all category members and by members of no other categories, and that are presumed to generate, of course, perpetual features. Essentialism is the view that kinds are defined by underlying properties or characters, in a sense that is shared by all category members and by members of no other categories, and that are presumed to generate, of course, perceptual features. Different versions of essentialism are distinguished by the kinds of properties allowed to count as a taxon's essence. According to intrinsic essentialism, essence are intrinsic properties such as genotype and morphological traits. According to historical essentialism, certain ancestral descendant relationships are essential features of biological taxa. According to Laporte, a taxon containing historical essences, two organisms have to share a common descent ancestor to be included in one taxon. Horses and echidnas, they do not have to be having same characteristics. Rather, the invariant feature of them is the property of having a common ancestor. According to essentials, species are natural kinds composed of essential characters shared in every member of the species. Here, species had to evolve in a discontinuous pattern where parents of the first member of the new species were members of the ancestral species. Parents of the first member of the new species were members of the ancestral species. There are three kinds of essentialism. Constitutive. Some classes of objects are what they are because they all possess invariant properties. Some class of objects are what they are because they all possess invariant properties. Then diagnostic. Classes of objects are diagnosable because all members share some salient properties. Then a definitional. Kinds have severally necessary and jointly sufficient definition properties. Several essentialist accounts are there for biological taxa. Homeostatic property cluster account. There are some causal mechanisms that are outcomes of laws of nature that causes individuals to cluster. Historical essence account. Biological taxa contain historical essence because they are defined by relations of common ancestry. Then intrinsic biological essentialism. Taxa have some shared intrinsic properties like developmental, genetical, etc. Then adaptive essentialism have some underlying causal factors including parental investment, ecological niches, etc. They have a typical number of species. Criticism. What are the major criticisms faced by this essentialism concept? Homeostatic property cluster account can be applied to metapopulations where members are in constant contact. Higher taxa cannot be maintained like this. Historical essence account deals with conserved developmental homologies shared by all members of the group. This is not logical as variations may occur over time. Then intrinsic biological essentialism depends only on intrinsic shaped properties and exclude environmental influences. Adaptive essentialism depends on typical developmental life cycle, but it may differ in different environments. There can be diagnostic properties for any taxonomic group, but we should not think that a group can be formed only if all the members possessed all the essences. And species like Homo sapiens can be two-legged and rational without every member of the group being two-legged and irrational. The nominalism, next concept, nominalism. The nominalistic concept of classification assumes that a natural property of all biological objects lies in their variability. Nominalists consider that only individuals and not taxons realistically exist. Species is a set of great many individuals and not just a single entity. Individuals can differ substantially within a single species. As such, species and higher taxa do not possess definition nominal essence, that is, we cannot define them, merely diagnose them. Defining a species by the possession of necessary and sufficient characters will fail because evolutionary changes result in the modification or loss of the defining characters. Therefore, the defining characters are not necessarily and are sufficient for the species identity. They are spatio-temporally localized, cohesive, and continuous entities. They exist apart whole reactions among other their constituents. Species have unique beginning, are continuous in time, and have a unique end. Once a species is extinct, no new organism can co-evolve that will belong to that particular species. According to nominalists, the sharp boundary between species is basically artificial and is only a matter of convention. It necessarily follows that some individuals in nearby populations will be more or less similar, and thus that the boundaries between the individual species will be fuzzy. Consequently, it will be difficult to differentiate individual species from one another. The nominalistic concept assumes that daughter species are formed in evolution more or less through continuous development from parent species, where the species moment in which an individual in a particular related line can be considered to a member of a new species is only a matter of convention. Even if we were to come to the conclusion that fundamental change occurs at a particular moment, which allows us to consider the particular individual to be a member of a different species in a population, there is continuous quantity that can gradually change over time or even fluctuate irregularly. The nominalist concept of species development and splitting apart in time is quite legitimate and has a great many proponents at the present time. Empiricism. Empiricism, otherwise known as extensional classification, numerical taxonomy, cluster analysis, inductive classification, phenomenal classification. Empirical theories are based on the idea that similar objects share a large number of properties. Objects may be classified according to those properties, but this should be based on neutral criteria, not on the selection of properties from theoretical points of view, because this introduces a kind of subjective criteria which is not approved by empiricism. This means that overall likeliness, sometimes termed phonetics, is the basis of this method. This seems at first to be properly scientific, but in further examination it turns out to be based on a number of problematic assumptions. What are the major criticisms? The first question is about the number of properties needed. Parsimony would advise to keep that number down. On other hand, it may be remarked that increasing the number of variables increases the probability of correct classification. If we assume that any number has an unlimited number of properties, then it is impossible to consider them all. By implication, any empirical classification is based in ways that cannot be controlled. Another problem is that the descriptions of objects cannot be objective and are always theoretically biased in ways we often cannot recognize or control. The third problem concerns the concept of similarity. Classification has often been defined as bringing like things together, but things cannot be similar by an objective way. Any object is similar to another object in some ways and dissimilar in other ways. By implication, empirical criteria for classification are not enough, and we need some guidance in how to determine which criteria should be used when determining similarity. So scientists have long recognized that modern day birds and reptiles share a common ancestor. Both groups lay shelled eggs and have scales in birds confined to the legs, nucleated red blood cells, and a number of skeletal similarities. Different methods in taxonomy arrive at different results. Methods based on historical development consider birds and reptiles as related groups. Birds may be considered a kind of reptile, while numerical taxonomy, based on a quantitative study of many structural similarities, considers birds and reptiles to be less related. Birds are not reptiles. The reason is that many animals develop similar structures because they adapt to the same ecological niches, but may have very different physiological backgrounds and are by biologists considered different groups. Next, cladism. Cladism is one of the main taxonomic schools and is rigorously based upon the phylogenetic principle as a means of biological classification. Cladistics branch is an approach to biological classification in which organisms are categorized in groups based on most recent common ancestry. The evidence for relationship is typically shared derived characteristics or synapomorphs that are not present in some different groups and ancestors. Shared derived characters. When a species splits during evolution, it will usually form two descendant species called the sister species, and in cladistic classification, sister species are grouped together. So cladistics therefore ignore phonetic similarities in organisms and attempt to uncover phylogenetic relationships by means of shared derived characters. As a result, they only recognize monophyletic groups. Paraphyletic and polyphyletic groups are excluded. In classifying species by phylogenetic relationships, the branching hierarchy of ancestral relations is created. This hierarchy exists independently of the methods used to discover it and is unambiguous of them in form. The original method used in cladistic analysis are derived from the word of the German entomologist Willi Henning, who referred to it as a phylogenetic systematics. The term clade was introduced in 1958 by Julian Huxley. Today, cladistics is the most popular method for inferring phylogenetic trees from morphological data. In 1990s, the development of effective polymerase chain reaction technique vastly expanded the amount of data available for phylogenetics by involving biochemical and genetic traits. At the same time, cladistics rapidly becomes popular in evolutionary biology because computers made it possible to process large quantities of data about organisms and their characteristics. The cladistic method interprets each shared character as a potent piece of evidence for grouping. Synapomorphies, shared derived characters, is viewed as evidence for grouping, while simpliciomorphs, shared ancestral characters, are not. The outcome of cladistic analysis is a cladogram, a tree-shaped diagram or dendrogram that is interpreted to represent the best hypothesis of phylogenetic relationships. Data include molecular, morphological, ethological, and a list of operational taxonomic units, OTUs, which may be genes, individuals, population, species, or larger taxa that are presumed to be monophyletic. Then building a cladogram. How to build this? A species event in which an ancestral lineage branches into two new lineages is the basis for each branching point or node. Each node represents the last point at which the new lineages shared a common ancestor. The bottom or root of the tree represents the common ancestor shared by all organisms of the cladogram. A cladogram's branching patterns indicate degrees of relatedness among organisms because lineage 3 and 4 share a common ancestor more recently with each other than they do with lineage 2. Likewise, lineage 2, 3, 4 are no more closely related in terms of ancestry with each other than any of them related to lineage 2. Terms of character states. Plesiomorphy. Plesiomorphy in the sense an ancestral state in a character that a taxon has retained from its ancestors. Then simpliciomorphs do not mean that the taxa that exhibit that character state are necessarily closely related. For example, reptilia is traditionally characterized by being cold-blooded, whereas birds are warm-blooded. In reptiles, cold-bloodedness is a plesiomorphy inherited from the common ancestor of traditional reptiles and birds. It is simpliciomorph of turtles, snakes, and crocodiles and birds. Genapomorphy, separate form, or derived state as an innovation and used to diagnose a clade. Autapomorphs, features that are derived in individual taxa and do not express anything about relationship among groups. Synapomorphs, found in many closely related organisms, where possession of digits in Homo sapiens is a synapomorphy within the vertebrates. Then homoplastic, character shared by two or more organisms but is absent from their common ancestor and is evolved by convergence. Both mammals and birds are warm-blooded. However, their common ancestor is a group lacking this character state, so the state must have evolved independently in two clades. Monophyly. Holophyly is a group of taxa, clade composed only of a common ancestor population, and all of its descendants. Then monophyletic groups are typically characterized by shared derived characteristics, synapomorphs, which distinguish organisms in the clade from other organisms. Then paraphyly consists of the group's last common ancestor and all descendants of that ancestor, including a few. One or more members of a paraphyletic group is more likely related to excluded group, that is, its other members of the group. Paraphyletic groups are identified by combination of synapomorphs and simpliciomorphs. Then polyphyly is a group whose members come from multiple ancestral sources regardless of similarity or characteristics. It is applied to groups that share similar features known as homoplasties formed by a result of convergent evolution. Criticism. Decision also whether a particular character is a simpliciomorph will have challenged the evolving subject to judgment. The cladistic method does not identify fossil species as actual ancestors of a clade. Instead, fossil taxa are identified as belonging to separate extinct branches. While a fossil species could be the actual ancestor of a clade, there is no way to know that. Therefore, a more conservative hypothesis is that the fossil taxon is related to other fossil and extant taxa by means of shared apomorphic features. Cladistic analysis incorporates a dichotomous branching model, but evolution is not necessarily dichotomous. Therefore, a most conservative hypothesis is that the fossil taxon is related to other fossil and extant taxa by means of shared apomorphic features. The transformed cladistic arose in the late 1970s and attempted to solve some of these problems by removing assumptions about phylogeny from cladistic analysis, but it just remained unpopular. Then last one, evolutionary classification. The concept of descent with modification lead to phylogeny, the study of how living and extinct organisms are related to one another. Advances in phylogeny in turn lead to phylogenetic systematics or evolutionary classification. Evolutionary taxonomy, evolutionary systematics or Darwinian classification is a branch of biological classification that seeks to classify organisms using a combination of phylogenetic relationship, shared descent, progenitor descendant relationship, serial descent, and degree of evolutionary change. This type of taxonomy may consider many species rather than single species so that groups of species can be inferred as giving rise to new groups. The concept found is most well known from the form of modern evolutionary synthesis of early 1940s. Evolutionary taxonomy differs from linear taxonomy in that it builds evolutionary trees. It groups organisms into larger categories that reflect lines of evolutionary descent rather than overall similarities and differences. The Visayan cactus or Chromogram is the best evolutionary tree for showing both shared and serial ancestry. First, a cladogram is generated. Generalized ancestral taxa is identified and specialized descendant taxa are noted as coming off the lineage with a line of one color representing the progenitor through time. Progenitor taxa may have one or more descendant taxa. Cactus, the Visayan cactus evolutionary tree. The concept of descent with modification lead to phylogeny, the study of how living and extinct organisms are related to one another. Advances in phylogeny in turn lead to phylogenetic systematics or evolutionary classification. Evolutionary taxonomy, evolutionary systematics or Darwinian classification is a branch of biological classification that seeks to classify organisms using a combination of phylogenetic relationship, progenitor descendant relationship, serial descendant, and degree of evolutionary change. This type of evolution taxonomy may consider many species rather than single species, so the groups of species can be inferred as giving rise to new groups. Then the concept found is well known for its a form of modern evolutionary synthesis in the early 1940s. It groups species into larger categories that reflect lines of evolutionary descent rather than overall similarities and differences. The Visayan cactus or chromogram is the best evolutionary tree for showing both shared and serial ancestry. First, a cladogram is generated. Generalized ancestral taxa are identified and specialized descendant taxa are noted as coming off the lineage with the link of one color representing the progenitor through time. So, progenitor taxa may have one or more descendant taxa. Hierarchy of classification. Taxonomic rank is the relative level of organisms, group of organisms in a taxonomic hierarchy. Example of taxonomic ranks are species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain, etc. A given rank involves more specific descriptions of life forms. Above it, each rank has more general characteristics that include groups of organisms related to each other through inheritance of traits and features from common ancestors. In his landmark publications such as System and Nature, Linnaeus used a ranking scale limited to kingdom, class, order, genus, species, and one rank below species. So later 7 main taxonomic ranks were identified: kingdom, phylum or division, class, order, family, genus, species, etc. In addition, domain, proposed by Linnaeus, is now widely used as a fundamental rank. Kingdom is the largest level of classification, which is divided into subgroups of various levels. Animalia. Phylum. This is the next level of classification and is more special than the kingdom. For example, chordata. Then class. Most general rank in the taxonomic hierarchy until phyla was introduced. Order is the most specific rank than class, having one or more than one similar families. A category of taxonomic hierarchy including various genera that share a few similarities. A group of similar species forms a genus. Genera with only one species are known as monotypic and more than one species are known as polytypic. Species, it is a basic unit of classification and a taxonomic rank of an organism as well as the unit of biodiversity. A species is often defined as the largest group of organisms in which any two individuals of the appropriate sexes or mating types can produce fertile offspring, typically by sexual reproduction. Homo sapiens. how to arrange this. Then intra-specific categories, variety. It can be defined as the group of population which is different from the parent population. It refers to the collective variations of local, geographical and ecological population. Then subspecies refers two or more populations of a species living in different subdivisions of species range and varying from one another by morphological characters. Subspecies are allopathic, geographical isolated and allochronic, never formed at the same time, at same place. Subspecies is only valid in infra-species category in zoology. Usually, the subspecies are reproductively isolated except in migratory species and in parasites and symbiotic host subspecies. Bengal tiger, Sumatran tiger, Siberian tiger, etc. Race, a group of genetically distinct populations of individuals within the same species which differ in their ecological requirement. Then sibling species, groups of closely related species which are reproductively isolated but morphologically similar. Gene. It is a community of potentially interbreeding individuals at a given locality which share a single gene pool. They are genetically similar. Gene has been used to denote the local population of a single species. Then cline. It may be defined as the group of local populations of a widely distributed species which exhibit regular or gradual stepwise modification from one part of their geographic range to another. Cline originate due to reduction in gene flow between populations of a species situated at the extremities of their geographical range due to distance. Population living at the extremities of geographical range are reproductively isolated even though they are connected by a chain of interbreeding populations. When such reproductively isolated populations from the extremities migrate and occupy overlapping areas, they form a ring of species. It is formed due to variations found between individuals of the same species where interbreeding is free. Locust has two forms like this and morphologically different but at some species. That is form, cline, then group. It is an assemblage of closely related taxa which does not want to place in a separate category. Then superspecies. It was introduced by Mayer in 1931. It is a monophyletic group of closely related and largely or entirely allopathic species that were once races of a single species but which now have attained species status. The component species of a superspecies were designed as semi-species.